Hello, little one. Welcome back to Oma's Rocking Chair. You ready to snuggle up and read some more of Hitty's story? We're reading from Hitty, Her First 100 Years by Rachel Field. Chapter 12, in which I go into Camphor, reach New York, and become a doll of fashion. It must have been toward the end of the Civil War that I had my first taste of going into Camphor. This was an experience I was to have many times later on. It is hard to describe the sensation exactly, but I think it must be rather like this newfangled fashion which people call taking ether, when they must have painful things done to themselves. At any rate, when Clarissa Price was to be sent away to a boarding school for young Quaker girls, I was packed up with many white balls that gave out a strong smell. Gradually, this overpowered me, so that I had no idea of what went on about me or of the passing of time. I know now that it must have been nearly 2 years that I lay in this state before the box was opened. Meantime, it had been removed from the Price's Philadelphia attic and sent to distant cousins in New York with some old furniture and odds and ends of material. But somehow or other, my box, which contained also a great many pieces of silk and ribbon, became separated from the rest by an absent-minded expressman who had a wagon full of goods to deliver. My box was therefore carried, along with a couple of trunks, to the attic of a house on Washington Square. Even after that, it was some time before anyone bothered to open it. I was unearthed at last by Miss Millie Pinch, who had come to stay a fortnight and sew for the Van Rensselaer family. She was rummaging about for some lace to edge Isabella Van Rensselaer's new petticoats when she found me. Instead of packing me up again or bringing me to one of the children, she carried me down to her own room, where she hid me on the top shelf of her wardrobe. I began to feel that I had not fared very well after all, but I changed my opinion that night after supper when Miss Pinch brought me out and began measuring me for new clothes. I can see her now as I write, her thin, plain face with its nearsighted blue eyes bent over me, her mouth bristling with rows of pins in a way that was terrifying to behold. Her fingers were thin and yellow, but she could do marvelous things with them, as I was soon to learn. "I'm going to show them a thing or two," she said, for she had a way of talking to herself when no one was about. "When I've got you dressed up, miss, they'll see that I'm as good a dressmaker as any of these fancy ones from Paris. I'm only fit to sew children's petticoats and second-best dresses, am I? Well, we'll see." She snapped her lips together so tight at those words that I feared she would swallow some of the pins. After a while, I learned not to agitate myself about this. Miss Pinch was gifted above most when it came to handling pins. As for her needle and thread, she was equally skillful, and I have never seen anyone who had such a way with scissors. She used enormous ones, too. At first, I felt sure those great shining blades were going to meet and snip me in two. But again, I survived, to reappear in an outfit that would have been considered positively scandalous by the families of all my former owners. You see, I was to be Miss Pinch's masterpiece, her proof that she was a fashionable dressmaker and not merely a seamstress by the day. She was far too poor to buy a model, so when I turned up, it was like an answer to her prayers. She certainly spared no pains upon me. I used to wonder how she could keep awake to work on my things after she had been sewing all day. But I think she loved making tiny ruffles in pin tucks, setting in darts with such fine stitches it seemed no human hand could have made them, and fitting my things again and again to make sure every fold and gathering was right. All through those solitary evenings in the back bedroom, she kept up her queer fragments of talk, so that I came to have an odd and rather jumbled idea of the various members of the household. She would say with a sniff, "So Miss Lily must have mother-of-pearl buttons and 3 rows of braid to her basques, must she? And a taffeta for the next assembly, so she'll have plenty of partners." Well, I could tell them a thing or two, and how unbleached muslin's too good for her when she's in one of her pets. Or again, as her fingers whipped and stitched and shaped my tiny garments, I would hear her muttering threats such as, "Just let Master Harry try hiding my thimble again, and I'll go straight to his mother and tell her how the china shepherdess on the drawing-room mantel came to be broken." Then, with a particularly spirited snip of her scissors, "And Miss Isabella needn't think because of her big eyes and those curls that she's better than the rest of the world. Telling me she won't wear the petticoats because they've only got Hamburg edging and 2 rows of tucks instead of 3, the little peacock." And Miss Pinch's face would grow as sharp as her name, and 2 round spots of red would come into her cheeks, till what with the pins bristling from her mouth and her long scissors besides, I would grow quite terrified of her. But how she could sew! I am sure no doll ever underwent so great a change in 2 short weeks. No butterfly emerged more resplendent from its cocoon than I from the hands of Miss Millie Pinch. Except for my corals, only my chemise remained of my former wardrobe. I doubt if this would have been kept had she not thought it a remarkably fine piece of linen cloth. How is it possible for my poor pen to do justice to my new attire? To the watered silk dress with draped skirt, fitted waist, and innumerable bows. How can I describe the blue velvet pelisse embroidered with garlands no bigger than pinheads? How tell of the little feathered hat and the muff of white eiderdown? "There now," said Miss Pinch, turning me around when my toilette was finally complete. "You're as stylish as anyone from here to 14th Street. And I don't care if I do say so." So I became a doll of fashion, which only goes to show what we never know from what direction miracles will come. Who would have turned the shabby, hard-working Miss Pinch to be made over into a fashion plate? That next day I spent on her bureau, staring in fascinated wonder at my reflection in the mirror. I could not get over the queer effect of my familiar features in such new and wonderful attire, and despite all the warnings I had heard from the families of both Little Thankful and Clarissa, I could not but find it extremely pleasant to be as well dressed as the pictures of the people in Godey's Lady's Book, which lay open beside me. Then suddenly, without any warning, the door opened, and instead of seeing Miss Pinch's face in it, there appeared the features of a very pretty little girl of 8 or so. She had such pink cheeks and bright eyes and thick chestnut curls that I was enchanted. Her clothes, too, were handsomer than any other child's I had ever seen, for she wore a plaid silk with scallops of crimson braid and ever so many small gilt buttons. She peered all about the room cautiously, then closing the door softly behind her, she came over to the bureau. The look of surprise on her face grew and grew as she examined me. When she had seen every smallest ruffle and pintuck, she carried me away, down several flights of stairs and into a big hall with long gilt-framed mirrors. A tall lady in a sealskin jacket and small hat with ostrich plumes was just coming in at the door. The little girl ran to her and held me out. "Why, what have you got there, Isabella?" asked the lady, taking me from her hands. "Where in the world did you find such a thing?" "In Miss Pinch's room," she answered, "and I mean to have her, for Miss Pinch is too old and ugly to play with dolls." "How often must I tell you to keep out of the servants' rooms?" her mother reproved her. "I saw her through the door," Isabella explained, which was the truth in a way, but not all of it, as I well knew. "And see, she has a real fitted waist. It's made of your old blue silk, and the pelisse is from Lily's velvet." "So they are," said her mother, examining them. "It doesn't seem possible that Miss Pinch could have made anything so stylish." Unfortunately, at that very moment, the dressmaker had come to the door to call Isabella up to a fitting. She heard the words and saw them bending over me. "If you please, Mrs. Van Rensselaer," she said primly, "that's my property, and I would thank you to keep Miss Isabella from meddling in what's none of her affairs." I think Isabella's mother was annoyed that Miss Pinch should be in the right for once. She was tired from an afternoon of shopping, and her tongue was sharper than she realized. She said afterwards that she had not meant to hurt the seamstress's feelings. Well, a good many sharp words passed on both sides, and Isabella interrupted every other minute to say what she meant to have me. After some questioning, it came out where Miss Pinch had found me, and that she had dressed me in the evenings. "Then she does belong to us, Mamma," cried Isabella. "She does if she came out of our attic and has clothes of your silk and Lily's." But Miss Pinch was equally firm. She said she was sorry, but I was her property, and she meant to exhibit me as a model to show she was a better dressmaker than most people gave her credit for being. I listened to the whole scene and felt very uncomfortable, because they all said so many unpleasant things. I have no idea how it would have ended if Isabella's father had not come in and insisted on knowing what was the matter. He was a portly, polite gentleman with brown whiskers and a great many seals dangling from his watch chain. When he had heard both sides, he gave his verdict. "The doll," he began, clearing his throat solemnly. "Her name is Hitty, Father," prompted Isabella, who had already explored my underwear. "The doll, Hitty," he continued, "is undoubtedly Van Rensselaer property since she came out of our attic. But her clothes are Miss Pinch's, since they would be nothing but scraps fit for the wastebasket had it not been for her skill." He bowed to her very politely, and she actually smiled in return. "But, Father," put in Isabella, "what use is she without her clothes? And what use will her clothes be without her?" "Exactly," he agreed. "I couldn't have put the case more simply myself. I believe, my love," he added, turning to his wife, "that Isabella has a legal turn of mind." "Mind," I heard Miss Pinch sniff under her breath. "She's got a temper, that's what she's got." By this time, however, Mrs. Van Rensselaer was sorry for what she had said, and Miss Pinch felt better because Mr. Van Rensselaer had been so polite to her. A little more discussion took place, and at last it was agreed that I was to be bought for Isabella. Furthermore, her mother was to recommend Miss Pinch and her sewing to a modest establishment on Stuyvesant Square. I was to be taken over to prove what wonder she could perform with her needle. You can imagine how happy I was over the arrangement. Although Miss Pinch was right about Isabella's temper and certain other shortcomings, still she was an attractive child, one of the most beautiful and high-spirited I have ever known. I must confess that I greatly enjoyed my stay with the Van Rensselaers of Washington Square, though I fear that my late Quaker owners would have deplored the worldliness of their ways. Isabella had at least a dozen dolls in her nursery, but she preferred me to all of them. It began by her interest in my elaborate costume, but later I am sure that she came to care for me almost as much for myself. At any rate, she defended me against all criticism, and once I remember when a caller remarked that I was not exactly a beauty, she lost no time in replying, "Well, neither are you." I saw little of her older sister Lily, who attended a young ladies' seminary several streets away, besides being busy with lessons in music and dancing and the art of flower painting. Isabella and her brother Harry, who was 10 and 2 years her senior, were taught at home by Harry's tutor, Mr. Gerald. Mr. Gerald was a pale, serious young man who apparently loved Latin more than anything else in the world. He was much more interested in getting Harry far enough along to read a book he called Caesar than he was in putting Isabella through her fractions and spelling lessons. In short, Isabella did about as she pleased. She was her father's pet, being the youngest and such a gay beauty. He often took her with him on long walks and read to her an hour each evening from Nicholas Nickleby. I was usually present on these occasions. As had been the case with my other owners, my smallness appealed to her. She almost never left me at home, whether she was off for a shopping expedition with her mother to the merchants of 14th Street, or to drive with her in the barouche when she paid calls on Stuyvesant Square or along Fifth Avenue, or when she went with Harry to learn the waltz and polka at Monsieur Petot's dancing school the other side of Washington Square. Until then, the only dancing I had seen was sailors' hornpipes and those performed by the savages. So Monsieur Petot's ballroom, with its polished floor, the square piano and violin playing, while all the feet wove in and out in intricate steps of the lately imported dances from Paris, filled me with amazement. Isabella usually left me with Annie, her mother's maid, who brought us there each Friday. But once I remember she set me up on top of the piano. I have never forgotten how it felt to have the music going on directly under me. I seemed to be part of it, and as I watched the children waltzing, I determined that I, too, would acquire this graceful new accomplishment. But it was not so easy to do as to see. I discovered that night when I practiced in the privacy of the nursery after everyone was in bed. My spirit was willing enough, but my pegs were not. It was the old difficulty of my legs being each in one piece and not made to move separately. So, though I could remember the music of the roses and minuet waltz they had played that afternoon, and though I knew the steps my feet ought to take, still I was powerless to lift them in more than a clumsy thump or two. So I put the idea of dancing from me. I am not one to give up easily, but I do know the impossible when I meet it. That year, I was to see another celebrated gentleman, one even more famous than Mr. Whittier. It came about entirely by chance on a walk which Isabella and her father were taking one Sunday morning. The weather was so snapping cold that Isabella's cheeks were almost as red as the new cashmere dress she wore under her blue pelisse. She had a red feather in her little round hat, too. I remember I thought it looked very nice against her bobbing curls. I was also in my best, eiderdown muff and all. Mr. Van Rensselaer had been to leave some calf's foot jelly and a bottle of sherry with a sick friend. We were returning along the east side of Fifth Avenue when the event occurred. Just as we neared the entrance to the Brevoort House, a hotel of fine proportions and pillars, several gentlemen were seen to come out. People were always coming and going there, so I thought nothing of this till I heard Isabella's father saying in a low voice, full of interest, "Why, I do believe that is Dickens in the greatcoat. I heard he was to stay at the Brevoort, but I had forgotten." "Not Charles Dickens, father?" asked Isabella with more awe in her voice than I had ever heard before. "Not the man who wrote Nicholas Nickleby?" "Certainly, my dear. I'm sure I cannot be mistaken, so take a good look at him." Although Isabella was usually a most composed child, this seemed too much for her. Indeed, she was so overcome that she dropped me almost at the very feet of the great man. I felt overcome myself, humiliated to be in such a position before him. But Mr. Dickens rose to the situation, or rather stooped to it, for he bent and picked me up most gallantly. With a pleasant bow and smile, he returned me to Isabella, while the two men with him and Mr. Van Rensselaer looked on with amused expression. "Oh, father," said Isabella, when the men had driven off in their carriage, "did you see? He picked up Hitty himself. And it was his right hand, too, the one he writes all the books with." "Yes," her father agreed, "it will be quite a story to tell your grandchildren." But Isabella did not wait to tell her grandchildren about it. Every one we met must hear the story, and for months to come I was brought out and exhibited as the doll who had been held in the very important right hand of Mr. Dickens. I do not wish to seem proud, but I cannot help wondering how many other dolls can boast of such an honor.